In this segment, we're going to discuss a particular kind of financial analysis called DuPont analysis. And I'm sure you're wondering, why is it called DuPont analysis specifically? Well, it comes out of the DuPont company. In fact, it comes specifically, it's a return on investment formula that was developed by a DuPont explosives salesman back in 1914. His name was Donaldson Brown, and he used it in DuPont, and then later on he became the CFO at General Motors. But by the time he was deploying it widely at General Motors, it was already known as the DuPont formula. You can see him here as a young DuPont salesman and later on as a very wily CFO of General Motors. And I would encourage you to read through this paper in the Accounting Historian's Journal about the influence of this salesman as he developed a lot of financial measures. Well, his formula is actually pretty simple, 3 letters, very much like the theory of relativity. E equals mc squared. You have to know what E, M, and C stand for. But in our formula, what do R, T, and P stand for? Well, R is the rate of return on the capital invested, or the invested capital, a return on investment. And it's broken down into 2 parts, the turnover of invested capital and the percentage of profit on sales. And those, in terms of our thinking of ratio analysis, it's really, in essence, a combination of 2 ratios. And so writing it in our ratio analysis terminology, we have the return on investment or return on assets here is net margin times asset turnover, where our net margin is the net income divided by sales. Our asset turnover is the sales divided by total assets. And obviously, if you multiply them together, the sales cancel out and you get net income over total assets, which is your return on assets. So it's a very straightforward and simple formula, but it helps us think about 2 key drivers of our financial performance. Coming back to our drivers figure from earlier, you can see the operating margin here on the left, which is our net margin is a little different type of margin, but operating margin is a key to that. And asset productivity, thinking about asset turnover as a key measure ratio of looking at that. And this is a trade-off of that part of the triangle that we presented earlier. And in fact, it can articulate 2 kinds of strategies. You can take a profit path toward return on assets or a turnover path, but you end up at the same destination, return on assets. And you can think of different industries that may focus on one or the other. In fact, the industries that have a lot more value added, like manufacturers that create the products and add a lot of value to the products, will have higher margins and may not have as good a turnovers. And the retailers and wholesalers who sell those products may not have as good a margin, so they have to turn over the product, turn over their inventory a lot faster. So there's different paths, but they might end up with the same return on assets, just different strategies given their role in the supply chain. I want to also introduce another term here, GMROI. It's often pronounced GMROI, and it stands for gross margin return on inventory investment. It's similar to DuPont, but it's a little more narrow. It's focusing on gross margin, not the net margin, so looking at the just sales and cost of goods sold and what is the gross margin, and then the inventory turnover, not the overall turnover of assets, but the inventory turnover specifically. And you can see when you multiply your gross margin, gross profit over sales, times inventory turnover, which is sales over inventory, the sales cancel out and you get gross profit over inventory, which is the gross margin return on inventory investment. And it's narrower than the DuPont, but it's focused more on evaluating inventory decisions and their impact on profitability. And this will come to play in a lot of supply chains. For example, in retailers specifically, you can think about 2 different paths here. You think about grocery stores having very low margins, right? So they have to have high turnover in order to get a good return on that inventory. On the other extreme, you may have jewelry stores that have very high margins, but they want to always be able to make sure they make a sale and have plenty of inventory, so their inventory turnover may be low. And the net effect is that they may have very similar GMROI, even though they have very different strategies of having a profit path or a turnover path. So you can see that playing out in a more narrow aspect in a particular industry. In fact, you can even think about, even in the same type of industry of like clothing sales, you can think of a Macy's. In the U.S., we have Macy's as a very high-end retail store. Will have higher margins, maybe not as fast of a turnover. And you have the other extreme as a TJ Maxx. It's another retailer, but they have much lower margins, lower prices, so they have to turn things over faster. So you can see this trade-off, profit path and turnover path across industries, within an industry of retail, and even within a part of a retail sector, having those different paths toward the same type of return on investment. I want to close by talking about the fact that return on equity is actually the focus of most DuPont analysis now. Even though initially when it was used in DuPont, it was return on assets, the first two components here, we've now added financial leverage as the third part of this to lead to return on equity. And you can see here, again, with the first two components are the same, net income over sales, sales over total assets. They cross out to give us, put these two together, we get ROA, return on assets. But then we go further, adding the financial leverage, which is your assets over equity. Then the assets cancel out, and when we get these together, we get our return on equity. It brings in the third component, and it looks at the role of taking on debt to be able to drive returns for the equity investor. And so our value driver triangle needs a foundation. When thinking about the value for shareholders, is that financial leverage can be incorporated to really drive value. It's a key component here. But that also can bring in some risks, right? There's more risk when you take on debt. So thinking about that foundation of leverage and risk. And in general, we need to be thinking, when we're thinking about driving value, we need to think about the risks we have in our supply chain as well, in terms of the overall value we're providing to our shareholders, or the returns we give them, the risks we expose them to in giving them a good combination for their investment. So it gives you a DuPont analysis as a way of looking at different paths towards the same objective of return on assets, or more broadly, return on equity. And you can also be more narrow to focus on particular parts, such as gross margin and inventory.